So 2 years ago, I made a game in an hour using Hazel, my game engine. This was inspired by Danny making a game in 1 hour using Unity. I basically wanted to make the exact same game that he made in Unity, but in Hazel. That way I could kind of like see, first of all, what it would even be like making a game, because back then Hazel was like in its infancy. I mean, it had barely any features. And so I kind of spent a lot of that time that I had to make the game making like the actual engine, like filling in the gaps of what was missing in the engine. That of course, far from ideal, and I mean that not only meant that I couldn't actually physically make the same game because we were missing things like audio and physics, it meant that the precious time that I did have was not spent using the engine and making the game, but spent like trying to like implement some weird like collision detection thing to make it playable and hack like some bloom in there by adding glow in Photoshop. I mean, it was a disaster. Now, however, it has been 2 years and lots has changed in Hazel. And so I thought that I would do the exact same thing again so that we can see how far Hazel has come. However, a few things are going to be different this time. Okay, so first of all, 2D. Nah, let's make a 3D version of this game instead. 1 hour time limit. I mean, I like that idea. It's nice to have like a finite amount of work for yourself. Like, I don't want this to go on forever. So I think maybe something that is theoretically possible content-wise to create within an hour is a good starting point. However, I don't want to just set a timer, start the game and then stop the timer, and then make sure that's within an hour. I want this to be chill. And so whilst I will have a timer running and I'm gonna try my best to kind of fit the actual work within that hour block, I'm not really going to be counting time that I spend like thinking, tweaking things, playing the actual game, because I might wanna like play it a few times as I go to make sure everything's working. I'm not really going to be timing that much. I think the actual game itself is definitely something that should be possible to complete in an hour or a little bit more. I'll have the original video linked up there, by the way. Check that out so that you kind of know what I'm talking about and what the original game was. So to summarize, I'm going to aim for like an hour of actual work rather than an hour of time passed since I began the project. And finally, the third thing that is different is Hazel now comes in 2 flavors. There's Hazel and there's Hazel 2D. Now in that video 2 years ago, I effectively used Hazel 2D. I used like the Game Engine series version of Hazel. That's all cool, but now I wanna bring out the big guns. I wanna actually use like the full version of Hazel. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, why there are 2 versions, what Hazel even is, then definitely check out the Hazel website, hazelengine.com. There's like an explanation there that explains what each version is and why we're even building a game engine. Speaking of which, did I mention that this website is hosted by Hostinger, the sponsor of today's video? No? Well, it is. And Hostinger is by far the best web host I have ever used. No matter who you are, you need a website. Let's be honest, the world revolves around the internet. Hostinger is a platform that provides you with a server that you can use to put something on the internet. A website would be an example of something to put onto the internet. There are plenty of other websites, platforms, companies you could go to get your web hosting done, but the thing that I really like about Hostinger is the fact that it is extremely affordable for the quality that you receive. This doesn't feel like a cheap web host by any means. Their platform is really, really solid. Their UI is fantastic. They have amazing tutorials and documentation to get you started and answer all of your questions. And did I mention that it's easy to set something up? I mean, this literally right here is what it took for me to set up hazelengine.com. And I set that up as a VPS rather than a simple shared hosting server because I have special plans for that website. Hostinger.com/Cherno is the link in the description to check out. Go ahead and sign up for one of their plans and give it a go. If you use the coupon code Cherno at checkout, you will receive an even bigger discount. It's the holiday season right now. It's like the perfect time to actually sit down, get a moment to set up your website and meddle with the internet. So definitely give Hostinger a go. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. I've been using them for the last few years and they've been amazing. Huge thank you to Hostinger for sponsoring this video and a lot of what we do with Hazel, to be honest. All right, we've got a game to make. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first step is to open Hazel. We actually have this great launcher that we can use now to create a new project. This is kind of new. We actually didn't have this up until a few months ago. Before that, we had to basically copy an existing project and then like modify it. So this is pretty cool. Now, once we open the project, it will open up in Hazelnut, which is the Hazel engine editor. We have this blank scene here, and all I'm going to do is basically set up like a basic skylight and a camera so that we can hit play and actually see something. During this video, I'm obviously going to speed up certain sections, but I'm not going to cut anything. So you guys will actually see every action taken to build this game and its assets in Hazel and whatever other software I use. Once we've got a basic scene set up, I wanted to go into Blender and actually create this 3D rocket. Now, I did have like the original rocket design that Danny made and then the one that I made with the Cherno logo on it as a guide. So I kind of just followed that and made it out of some basic primitives like this cylinder, the cone. I gave it a few materials, of course, and then I UV unwrapped the cylinder because I wanted to position that Cherno logo on it as a little signature like I did in the original 2D game. I did a little bit more tweaking and then I exported it in the GLTF format. Hazel also supports FBX, and that's mostly what I've been using thus far, but I've been trying to kind of switch to using GLTF a lot more. Once we have that, we can drag it in as a static mesh into Hazel. And here I'm just adding a directional light, playing around with it, seeing what looks nice. Now, I also added this kind of like burner area that I wanted to give an emissive material to. So here I am creating that emissive material inside Hazel and assigning it to the burner material so that we get this nice glow. Now, emissive materials, of course, don't actually emit light. They just work with the bloom effect. So what I'm doing here is actually creating a point light, parenting it to the rocket, and then putting it in like place of the burner so that we can actually get light emitting from that burner. Next, I'm going to add a rigid body and a capsule collider to the rocket so that we can actually get some kind of physics and collision detection. Now, I'm actually not really planning to use the physics system to do the actual like rocket movement. I'm going to basically recreate the same movement mechanics that I created in the original game. That way I have a little bit more control over it, and also it's a simple game. It doesn't really require a physics simulation. I care a lot more about the feel of the game than an actual like realistic physics simulation. And here I am simulating the actual physics and then playing the actual game so that we can see that rocket fall down. Now, next up, I want to introduce some behavior and interaction into this game. So I'm going to the project directory and opening up the Visual Studio solution that Hazel generated. Now, Hazel uses C# for scripting, so a lot of this actual scripting is going to be a lot like Unity and way less than what it was like in the original 2D game that I made a couple years ago, since that was entirely written in C++. So this is another huge step forward. What I'm going to do here might be slightly controversial. However, I'm actually going to look at the game that I made 2 years ago and basically steal a lot of the code from there. I just kind of want to make it feel more or less like the same game, or at least use that as a starting point. Now, a lot of it, of course, will need to be changed because it was written in C++. This is now in C#. Also, there was no like entity component system or any real API in that previous version 2 years ago, so this needs to dramatically change. But all of the math, that is kind of the stuff that I'm interested in, since that dictates the actual like logic and feel of the game, rather than like the API and all of that stuff, which doesn't really matter. As you can see here, I'm actually taking some of the values, the same values that I used in that game, and plugging them in here. We can do this via the UI with the C# public variable, of course, just like in Unity. And if we hit play, there's our rocket. It's moving up with the spacebar, and it has its own kind of gravity that is independent of the physics system because we're actually setting the rocket's position via the script. Now, next up, I want the camera to follow the rocket. I'm going to do this by creating a C# script for the camera. I'm duplicating the existing script just to make things a little bit faster, since if I create a new C# file, it's going to be completely empty. It's not going to, there's no template with the onCreate, onUpdate function, nothing like that. So this is just a little bit faster. Now, I could just parent the camera entity to the rocket entity, and that would satisfy the whole like camera following the rocket requirement. But the reason why I'm doing it in this script is because I might want a little bit more control over the way that the camera moves. I don't want to directly associate it with the rocket. So here I'm just finding the rocket, getting its translation, and setting up the camera's translation based on that, except for the Z-axis because I want the camera to be, of course, quite far from the rocket on that axis. Here you can actually see how to add a new script component to an entity. You actually have to type in the full kind of name. So in this case, rocket.camera. As long as that class has been compiled as part of the C# DLL, it will show up inside Hazel and everything will be good. That's our current workflow, and to be honest, I kind of like it. Some autocomplete would be nice, but I don't think there's any need to really create scripts using the editor UI if you're going to then open them in Visual Studio anyway. I also added this little kind of flaw just so that we can actually see what's going on, since the camera is moving with the rocket, which means it looks like nothing is moving. And as you can see, the rocket is now moving forward. This is beginning to feel a little bit like a tutorial, so I'm probably going to speed up some of these next steps. If you guys are interested, what I might do is make like a full non-sped up version complete with commentary and put that up somewhere, maybe on like a Hazel Engine channel. But for this video, let's just keep it concise. After making the rocket rotate to kind of face a direction based on its velocity, just like in the previous game, we more or less have the basic mechanic done. Scale is always a challenging thing when it comes to making games, so you'll see me kind of play around with the rocket scale and all of that throughout this video. Now I had an idea. I thought it would be cool if the rocket would actually kind of spin around its y-axis. This didn't really make sense in the 2D game, of course, but here, why not? So I quickly added that in. I also wasn't too happy that the kind of emissive burner wasn't really visible since we were at like a 90-degree angle to the rocket. So I also added like a little bit of X rotation so that it would kind of appear as if the rocket wobbled. This I think was a cool effect regardless of that burner. After some more tweaking, it's time to add in those pillars. Now Hazel does have like a default cone shape that we can use, but I wanted to kind of make this one a little bit more low poly, a little bit more simple, and have that option to modify it if I wanted to. So I made it in Blender, imported it, and there we have it. I placed a couple in the world just to see what it would look like. Then I wanted to give them a material. I just decided on this green color for now. Made sure that it had a mesh collider, and then I just created a prefab out of it because the plan is going to be to instantiate these via a level script. Now inside the level script, I'm adding a public prefab field so that we can then simply go back and drag in that pillar into that C# field so that we can instantiate it. And speaking of which, let's go back to the original game from 2 years ago and steal some more code. Now this part is actually quite different because back then, of course, no entity component system, no prefabs, nothing. Everything was kind of just in a data structure and then rendered inside an onRender function. So it really is quite different here. But the stuff that isn't different is the math, as I mentioned. So like calculating positions for the pillars, spacing them apart, reusing the pillars again when the rocket gets to a different part of the level. All of that stuff is more or less the same, but how do we convert that into this ECS system? Well, first of all, we don't really need a container to contain all of these kind of instantiated pillars because we can just instantiate them as children of this level entity. That's pretty cool because we already have that kind of children data structure, that list of children, which you can see me using here, and the rest of the code kind of translates more or less the same way. Now I have no idea about the scale of these things because we were just rendering them as like, I think 2D quads actually in that game 2 years ago, but we can always play around with the numbers. So for now I'm keeping them as is. And now if I hit play, you can see we have our pillars. A little bit weird position, and the floor obviously was just there for reference. So I'll need to reposition some things, maybe play with the scale, but more or less looks pretty cool. Now it's feeling a little bit slow, almost kind of feels like we're underwater. So that definitely needs to be fixed, or underwater theme, maybe. Now, if I zoom the camera out, kind of hard to do while playing, you can actually see that pillar reusing working, which is pretty cool. It kind of looked like maybe there weren't enough pillars because I could kind of see them appearing sometimes. So I just added another pair. And here we have our first kind of gameplay, I guess. Looks pretty cool. Now the next step is to create that floor and ceiling. Pretty simple stuff. We just need to position them in the right place. Make sure that they're big enough so that it looks nice. Give them some names and a material. And then finally, of course, we need them to follow the player so that we never run out of them. Now what I'm going to do here actually is parent the ceiling to the floor. That way, I only need to find the one floor entity in the C# script, move that, and then of course, since the ceiling is a child, it will also move. And here we have endless floor and ceiling and endless pillars. Now, one thing I'm not digging is that this Cherno logo is a bit kind of dark. So what I'm actually going to do is add some lighting because, you know, you want that Cherno logo nice and visible. There we go. Much better. Now we definitely want some kind of score, obviously. to see what the score is. So funny thing about Hazel is it doesn't actually have any like UI, you could say. We can render text, but it is all kind of in world space. It's like an entity part of the scene. It's not going to be in screen space. I mean, I guess you could use some C# code and like, you know, some math and all of that to actually make it effectively in screen space, but Hazel doesn't really quite offer that yet. It's, you know, we're working on it. But for this game, I actually think that's kind of okay, because what I'm going to do is just have the score hover above the rocket. We can also kind of push it back so that it's behind the pillars. I think that'll look really cool. Besides, modern UI in games, you know, they like to do this kind of stuff, and I think it definitely works for this game. Now, as for the score itself, nothing really too complicated here. The pillars are all evenly spaced apart, so just like in the original game, the score is really just a function of the rocket's X position. I also decided to get rid of the word score, so it looks cleaner. Now, I kind of forgot to add colliders to the floor and ceiling, so just quickly doing that here. And now we can actually make game over happen. So what I'm going to do is to the rocket, add a collision begin callback, which is basically a callback function that gets called when we collide with something, with this given other entity. We don't really care what we collide with at this point. We're just going to mark collided as true. And then the plan is in the onUpdate function, we can handle that game over, which in this case will simply just destroy this rocket entity. For certain reasons, we don't want to destroy it from within the collision callback. That's why I'm setting up this collided boolean, but you can see that with that in place, it works. We can lose the game. We can't really respawn, but that's okay. The rocket disappears when we hit something. Great, but not exactly satisfying. I feel like the rocket should, like, I don't know, crumble or something. Wouldn't that be cool? Yeah, it would. So let's go back to Blender and fracture this rocket. I'm just using the Cell Fracture add-on that is included as part of Blender. This takes like a few goes to get right, I think, because it somewhat does it randomly and you might want to tweak these parameters. In addition to that, if geometry isn't like a certain way, it might not work. So for example, this like cylinder body is missing its kind of top face. So I'm adding it back here so that we don't get that weird piece generating. Also, since dynamic like mesh colliders need to be convex, it's important to make sure that you don't have too much intersection of geometry happening, because then things will just explode, as you can see here. So I'm actually going to go back to Blender, maybe space these out a little bit more. Lots of tweaking. I think this is definitely going to be the part that pushes me over an hour, just because this whole fracturing business, you want to take some time to get it right. Once I'm more or less happy with it, I'm going to make a prefab out of it, and then we can simply instantiate that prefab with the exact same transform as the original rocket when we destroy that original rocket. So we're really just pulling the old switcheroo, and hopefully no one will notice. And here we go, testing it, boom. Now the pieces like just absolutely explode outwards. And again, I think that's probably because of the geometry intersecting itself. As I mentioned, lots of tweaking is necessary to get this looking right. I'm going to try my best with the limited time I have available to fix this up. Okay, there we go. I basically just made some bigger pieces, played with the scale, that kind of stuff. And I really like this effect of not really exploding outwards, but just kind of crumbling. I think it looks really cool. All right, time for everyone's favorite thing. Particles. Hazel still doesn't have a particle system though, but that's okay because it's actually really easy to write your own quick and dirty particle system with this current setup, especially because we have instanced rendering, which means that we can render a lot of an identical mesh. What I'm going to do is just create this kind of empty particle emitter entity and put it right where I want the particles to come out of. That way we can more or less just instantiate the particles right at that entity's transform. Now, the first thing that I wanted to do with my particle system is set up like a little timer so that I could basically emit a particle, that little smoke particle that's supposed to pop out every now and then. I wanted to emit it basically every half second. So that's why I set the emit rate to 0.5. I'm just gonna write some simple code here to basically instantiate the particle and give it some kind of transform. What I'm gonna do here is obviously not parent the particle to the rocket because I don't want it to move with the rocket. I'm going to add it to like a smoke particle container just so I can like keep track of it and all of that. And of course I need to make sure that I instantiate it like in world space, not relative to this rocket entity, of course. So that's why I'm using the world transform of this particle emitter entity. I'm adding a little bit of an impulse force in a random direction just to give it some movement, and adding it to that smoke particle container. Now let's actually create the particle prefabs so that we can instantiate them. The original game had square particles, so it only makes sense to make these cubes. Now I added a box collider here. To be honest, I don't know why I did that and I'll remove it later, but yeah, just thought that would be cool, I guess. So I hit play, rocket immediately explodes because it's emitting the smoke particle, which is colliding with the rocket, which is causing it to explode. So again, instead of removing that box collider, I decided to go into the project settings and add another physics layer for the particles, because I guess for some reason I wanted the particles to collide with each other, but not with like the default layer, which is the layer that the rocket is on. Again, not sure what happened to me here, but yeah. And so now finally, whoa, why are there so many? There's supposed to be only one every half second. What is going on? But hey, they're colliding with each other, so there's that. And to be honest, this looks kind of cool, especially with the lighting coming from the burner. I decided to log the smoke timer to see if anything was wrong, and instead I was greeted with a lot of null reference exceptions. Now, our debugging isn't the greatest, but it's pretty easy to see where the null reference exception is coming from. And of course, if your script crashes, then the rest of that script is kind of more or less ignored, or at least that function exits, of course. So therefore the smoke timer was just always, 0, I guess. And we were emitting them every frame. So once we fixed that up by actually creating a smoke particle container, you can see we're emitting these lovely smoke particles, which I think look pretty cool. Now let's make them spin a little bit because they're kind of still. So we're gonna add some angular velocity to the rigid body, and there we go. Now they kind of spin. Cool. Now let's do the same, but for those kind of glowing fire particles, which I think will look really cool. For this, I actually want to get the rocket entity, get the rocket script, so that we can actually get the velocity of the rocket and then emit those particles into the opposite direction of the velocity. That way, they'll basically be emitted out of that burner, which is the intention. Now, the reason I'm checking for rocket entity being null a lot, you may have noticed that everywhere, is because we do actually destroy the rocket if we die. So it's possible for the rocket not to exist, and we just want to protect our code from that so that it doesn't crash. I'm not going to bother making the rocket actually emit the particles. Right here in the emitter, I'm just going to check for the spacebar being pressed, and we will emit those particles. Of course, if the rocket is dead and null, then no particles will be emitted. Now let's create that fire particle prefab, give it a nice emissive material, and hey, that looks a little bit weird. I mean, I guess it's working, but they're like spinning a lot. Why is that happening? Oh yeah, it's because they're literally being emitted like on top of each other, and they're colliding and they're going crazy because Cherno added that box collider for some reason. Before I abandoned my box collider, however, I decided to tweak some values because maybe that's the reason. I don't even know why I did that, to be honest. Always fun watching these as like a little post-mortem reflection, seeing yourself being a comedian. And now, finally removing the box collider from the smoke particle and from the fire particle. There we go. That looks much better now. Although they are kind of still. So let's maybe give them a bit more force. Maybe I misjudged that. Yeah, there we go. That looks much better. Now, the other thing that I'm noticing here is it kind of looks cool when they get close to the pillars because they're emissive, but they're not actually emitting light, as I mentioned. So let's just add point lights to them. That'll be cool. Now, you might be thinking every particle with a point light, that is kind of expensive. However, thanks to Hazel using Forward Plus rendering, it's actually pretty cheap. Depends how many you have, of course, and if they're overlapping, but I think we've only got a couple hundred at most here, so it should be fine. I also decided to change the pillar material to be metallic because that way the specular highlight from those fire particle lights will just look a lot better. All right, more tweaking that I'm definitely not going to be too stressed about, thanks to the rules. Looking pretty good. However, I think it would look even cooler if the scene was a lot darker, since we have a lot of kind of emissive stuff going on. And based on the original game, the pillars are also, well, supposed to glow, I guess. So maybe like a night theme would suit this better. Now, the next thing that we really should do is actually set up a particle system, so to speak. Because the problem is we are spawning, especially the fire particles, since we spawn a lot more of them than the smoke particles, they're kind of just being spawned and never killed off. Additionally, we kind of lose the ability to control them over time, which is something we might want to do. We could give each particle a C# script, but let's be honest, that's not great. So instead, what I'm going to do is write this little particle system script. I've actually set it up as an entity here, which isn't like strictly necessary. But the point is we're going to be able to add each particle that we emit, or at least each fire particle that we emit, into this list, which we can then like manage and maybe scale down over time. And then once the life runs out, then we can destroy the particle entity. And of course, nothing works the first time. This time though, I'm going to actually check the log to see what's going on. And of course, another null reference exception. Same problem, I forgot the fire particle container. I should really just add them both to like the particle system entity, but whatever, guess we're doing containers. Now that that's all fixed, we can see the particles getting smaller over time and then dying. And to be honest, I really love the effect of the fire particle light on the smoke particles. I think that looks really cool. Now back to the environment. I don't really dig this kind of generated sky with the sunset or whatever is going on here, so I'm actually going to use this environment map, which you can download for free from Polyhaven. Blurring it looks very cool, of course, and we get something slightly more interesting, I think. Now let's make those pillars change their colors. I'm gonna go back to the original game and grab this HSV to RGB little conversion function and adapt it into our C# script, getting those default values as well from the original game, and then modifying the material. Now, because they all have the same material, I can actually just get like the first child, because they're all instantiated under this level class, the first child, which is the first pillar, get its mesh component and get the first material from that mesh component. Now, materials are also a little bit interesting in Hazel in the sense that if you modify them whilst playing the game, then that state, it kind of remains. So you'll see me like stop this at times later on, and whatever the material was like when the game ended, when I hit the stop button, it kind of remains the same. This is completely okay for us here though, because of course we're actually setting these parameters every time we play the game, so it's fine. Now about that pillar glow we talked about, that both Danny's game and my game from 2 years back had as well. Let's make the pillar material emissive. However, I had this idea of progressively making it more and more emissive. So every 10 score that we get, basically, I want it to suddenly jump up in brightness. I don't want this to be like a smooth thing, and I don't want them to remain the same level of emission throughout the game. And of course, as with the other emissive material objects that we have in the scene, I also want this to emit light, so I'm going to add a point light to each pillar. Now this also means that the color of the point light and its intensity should probably go hand in hand with the pillar color and the pillar's emission. So I'm also going to set that up through the C# script. The floor and ceiling is kind of looking all dark and depressing, so I'm also going to add the pillar material to those. And there we have it. We basically have a more or less finished game. Here's some beautiful sped up gameplay going as far as I can. I really wanted to kind of test the emission here to see just how bright it would get, but I think it's pretty manageable. And I got all the way up to 102. I think it looks really cool, until we disable bloom, that is. There are those materials persisting, as I mentioned. Now, as I played this and I got all the way up to 102, I realized that the game is kind of very repetitive, obviously, and there's no real challenge. You could just probably keep doing that forever. So I wanted to add some kind of speed up to the rocket, because of course, if the rocket gets faster over time, eventually you will just die. My first test of this proved that it just sped up way too quickly. I wanted to look at the actual velocity value here, and I did, and I realized it was just too much. So I went back to the script and just made it 10 times slower. And to be honest, the game's feeling kind of nice. Now, 2 years ago, Hazel didn't have any audio system whatsoever, and now we actually have quite a good one. So whilst I'm not going to pull a Danny and somehow manage to write music within the 1 hour, I would love to do that, by the way, for an extended version of this game, but definitely not now. Sound effects, however, using BFXR, let's make that happen. The first one I wanted was some kind of explosion for when the rocket hits something. Putting that into Hazel is pretty straightforward, and we actually have quite a lot of parameters to play with. I'm not going to bother with any of that here though. We're really quite tight on time. Let's just make it play. And the simplest way I can think of to make it play is just play on awake for the fractured rocket, because of course that's what we instantiate when we hit something. Beautiful. Now we have no way of restarting the game from within the game, but it's okay. We're going to just shove that under the rug. I also thought it would be cool to have a little spawn sound. Yep, definitely cool. I think it's nice having these kind of 8-bit sound effects with these kind of graphics. Speaking of which, the font is really not doing it for me either for the score, so I went on dafont.com to try and find some free font to use. Slapping that into Hazel and playing around with the color and the size and all of that, I think we have a pretty cool result. One of the reasons why I decided to make it black, by the way, is because obviously it gets very bright with all of that emission later on in the game. So I wanted to always make that font visible. The text, by the way, is not affected by lighting or anything like that because it's kind of 2D and it's actually rendered on a separate layer, you could say, in a separate render pass, so nothing to worry about there. We also had this one little null reference exception as a result of, again, something trying to use the rocket when the rocket had already been destroyed, so I rearranged this script a little bit to be easier to read and make more sense and also fix that bug. I also realized that in the fractured rocket, I never actually set up that burner material. So I went through all of those fractured pieces and added in that material. So yeah, game looks pretty dope, I think, especially with that font. Here's some beautiful gameplay. Now, the one thing that I kind of didn't like is that the score was sometimes way hidden behind a pillar and it was like impossible to see. This is obviously a problem. So I had this idea of just animating it to go into like the center of the screen or around about that area so that after you die, you could actually see the score since there's that huge gap in the middle. Adding that was pretty straightforward, and after some tweaking, I think it looks pretty cool. And that's it. I'm gonna leave this game here. I really would love to take some more time and extend this. All in all, what I've done right here took me around an hour and 25 minutes. Well, that was pretty easy. That's because I didn't actually make the game now. I made it like before I recorded the first part of the video. Is that cheating? This is YouTube. Let's get real. So I think the cool part about the video that you guys just watched is that whilst it of course is sped up in certain areas, I actually didn't cut anything. Every single action that I took, whether that be code that I wrote or changed, or buttons that I clicked inside Hazel's editor, every single action was actually shown in that video. So theoretically, if you slow it down, that's a full-on tutorial. That being said, what I think I'm going to do is on a separate like Hazel Engine channel, I will actually play the real-time version of this video, and I might kind of talk about everything that I'm doing and effectively turn that into a tutorial that might be interesting for people who want to make games in Hazel or just see like what Hazel is like, because I think that's quite interesting. It's almost like a director's commentary considering it's my engine. As you can see, Hazel has come a long way in the last 2 years, and I'm even more excited for the future. If you want to support Hazel and get access to all of the source code, the actual engine that I use to make this game, then head over to patreon.com/thecherno. If you sign up with at least a $10 per month tier, you will get access to all of this source code and you will be able to make this same game and also see all of the source code behind the engine. Patreon is the platform that we use to fund this project. If we didn't have you Patreon supporters, then I wouldn't be able to hire people, I wouldn't be able to support myself and my family, I wouldn't be able to make all of these videos. So basically I'm saying that Hazel would not exist if it wasn't for you guys, and for that I am eternally grateful. I really want to release this game for you guys, but Hazel doesn't exactly have a way to release games at the moment. We can play games in the runtime, so in other words, we can actually play it as a standalone application, but the problem is there is no packaging of assets. There is like a lot of the engine internals are kind of exposed. It's a little bit messy to actually distribute games. I guess my point is we can play games standalone, but we can't really distribute games in the way that I would like to. So what I'm going to do is this. I have a final Patreon tier called Partner. There are around 50 generous supporters sitting in that tier who have not received any rewards other than the ones they would have gotten if they were at the $10 tier, the Supporter 3 tier. But they've been there. They've been there supporting Hazel. So what I'm going to do is initially I'm going to release this entire game for those partners. So if you are a partner, Patreon supporter, send me a message on Patreon and I'll hook you up. I'll give you this game and you'll be able to open it up in Hazel and play it right now. And that's kind of going to be the reward for partner supporters from now on. Any games that we make in Hazel, you guys will get the full source access to the games, the assets, all of that stuff, and you'll be able to open up that project within Hazel. However, I do still obviously want to release the game for free for you guys to play just for fun. But as I mentioned, we're just not quite there yet with Hazel. So what I'm going to be doing over the next like couple months or so, it might be difficult because of like the holiday season, but I'm going to be basically working as hard as I can to create this kind of distribution side of Hazel so that we can actually ship this game. Once that is done, I'm going to upload it for free onto like itch.io or something like that. So my point is, you guys will be able to play this game for free, but just not right now. And believe me, I'm super excited to actually officially ship like the first game made in Hazel. I mean, to be honest, this is the first, you could say, complete game that I've made in Hazel. But before I do that, I had so much fun making this game, and there's still so many ideas that I actually have that I think I might just keep working on it. Let me know if you guys want to see me continue working on this game and just make it better. I mean, like, I really want to make like a main menu screen, maybe a way to submit high scores or something like that. Christmas is coming up, so maybe we want like a bit of a Christmas themed version. If you guys want to see that, then definitely drop a comment below and let me know. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you are new. It's been an amazing year, and I'm so proud of all of the work that we've done, and as I mentioned, I can't wait for the next year and the year after that and all the amazing stuff we're going to be able to create. Don't forget to check out Hostingo using the link below. Have an absolutely fantastic holiday season, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.